A very good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining this morning's breakfast at UMHealth. And this morning we are very privileged to have a speaker all the way from Baltimore. Of course, we wish that he's here in person, but unfortunately he's here. He can't be here, and I am very happy to introduce our speaker for this morning, Professor Joseph Ali, who is the Associate Director of Global Programs at Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. And he's also an Assistant Professor, Department of International Health, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I'm so sorry, my throat's a bit itchy. And Mr. Joe and Professor Joe has a lot of experience with multi-site US and international bioethics research and training. For the past decade, he has managed the MedHEU Fogati African Bioethics Training Program, and he is also involved in the faculty Master of Health Research Ethics, which I think I saw a couple of slides in his presentation, so he'll share with you about it. And he has been very helpful in helping the faculty of more faculties to learn more and to develop skill in research ethics and bioethics as well. And he tried a bit just in.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, for that warm welcome. And hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you, even if it's virtual. I certainly would have preferred to be there in person, of course, but we'll take what we can get these days. So thank you again. I'm going to, as was mentioned, provide a bit of a presentation on some current ethical challenges in clinical research. I'll acknowledge up front that that I'm not going to go very deeply into any one particular issue that I'm going to cover today, but I hope to give a bit of an overview of some of the prominent issues that have been discussed recently in the literature and projects and the like. So I'm just going to go forward and not going to provide much of an introduction to research ethics. I'll operate with a basic assumption that many of you have already had some introduction to research ethics, but I'll rather jump right into these selected issues, which include some of the challenges related to institutional review board or research ethics committee harmonization when you have multiple committees that are reviewing research protocols, clinical research protocols. I'll also discuss a little bit the ethics of alternative and adaptive trial designs when used in clinical research. I'll talk a bit about managing signals of participant risk in large data-intensive trials, which are increasing in number of late. And then discuss a couple of consent-related issues. One relating to consent for future use of biospecimens or data in research. And then touch briefly on e-consent as a current issue. So let me go ahead and begin with the Institutional Review Board harmonization challenge. And this isn't new, certainly, but over the past few years has come increasingly into the attention of policymakers and others globally. Certainly researchers have faced challenges for many years around coordinating institutional review board or research ethics committee or research ethics board review across multi-site research. But a little bit of background, research ethics committees are expected to operate in a manner that shows their competence. And that includes having diverse expert and lay membership. It includes being trained to understand the duties and ethical requirements of operating as a member or administrator of an ethics committee. Importantly, that ethical criteria should form the basis of decisions, and there are a number of international guidelines that provide that function of identifying those ethical criteria that should be applied by ethics committees. And then lastly, I would argue that I think many others would, that there are two key goals for ethics institutional review boards or ethics committees. One being providing a high quality review, and the other being to provide an efficient review. And sometimes these can compete against each other to a degree. but I think an optimal practice would try to maximize both. And the other key ingredient to IRB functioning is independence. And what we usually mean by independence is that ethics committee should be free from controlling influences of institutional officials, of governments, of funders, of peers, and others. So they need to be able to operate with some degree of institutional autonomy to be able to demonstrate their legitimacy in the functions that they serve, as well as preserve their capacity to follow those ethics related principles and rules and not be unduly influenced by other external factors. There are, I think, globally, a few different common types of IRBs that includes, in some countries, national certain types of protocols. There are also very commonly, and this is extremely common in the United States, and I know Malaysia as well, institutional review boards, which are operating within an institutional context, like a research-intensive institution or university. And then there are independent or sometimes commercial IRBs, and those are institutional review boards that, as the name suggests, are independent of institutions or national bodies, and sometimes operate for profit, but serve to provide review, oftentimes of clinical research that's sponsor funded, and again, maybe multi-site. There are, as I mentioned, some guidelines that institutional review boards can refer to in identifying the key operational principles and requirements. There's a document that offers standards for institutional review boards issued by the World Health Organization. But there also are accrediting agencies, and as many of you may be aware, perhaps there is one in the Asian and Western Pacific region called FIRCAP, and that's an organization, as you can see on the screen here, that was conceived in Bangkok in the year 2000, so 22 years ago now, to provide capacity strengthening for institutional review boards in the region, as well as some accreditation procedures, which includes conducting an assessment of committees and offering some feedback, which can be acted upon by committees to improve their functioning, then to ultimately obtain an accreditation from the organization. FIRCAP is a WHO affiliated initially organization that was established through the TDR program. And I know that the Faculty of Medicine Institutional Review Board has received accreditation from FIRCAP. But going back to this multi-site issue for IRB review, there are different sorts of positions and arguments, I think, that have been put forward about whether or not to permit even multi-site institutional review board review of clinical trials that are multi-site. Some of the benefits, some have argued, of having multi-site review includes having robust consideration of local contextual issues and interests. So there may be some unique local issues that are either procedural, in terms of the kinds of procedural and policies that are required for implementation of clinical trials, maybe ethical, in terms of how certain kinds of ethics requirements are interpreted, or even legal, if there are local laws at a state or district level that might not be different across different parts of the country or even across different countries. The other potential benefit of having a multi-site IRB review process is the provision of local oversight. So local oversight entails some entity that's responsible for ensuring that the research that's being conducted by local investigators is being done in a manner that's responsible, and that includes some degree of accountability for actions. So that again can be very important. However, there have been some concerns that have been voiced about what had previously been a standard practice of having institutional review boards review a single protocol across many different sites for multi-site clinical trials. And some of those concerns include the obvious ones, which are time delays to research implementation. So if you have to go through many, many different IRBs to get approvals, it can significantly delay the time to implementation of a research study. There's also the potential for different views amongst different IRBs on what is ethically and legally required for a single protocol. And again, some may view that as a benefit, but some may see it also as a potential frustration. There's also the potential for poor management of submissions and amendments across different sites, which can lead to different versions of approved study materials and protocols and consent forms and the like. So you need a high degree of management of documents that are being used in the study and ensuring that they're being submitted to all the different committees that are supposed to review those documents. And then lastly, there could be complexities regarding reliance agreements. So if you're seeking to implement some form of negotiated agreement between institutional review boards, that can take some time. So as a result, there's been a push, at least in the United States and in some other countries and regions, towards this idea of requiring even single or central institutional review boards for multi-site clinical research. And as you can see in this US NIH policy document, the goal of the policy is to enhance and streamline the IRB review process in the context of multi-site research so that research can proceed as effectively and expeditiously as possible. And this policy in the United States was released in 2016 and became effective in 2018 and applied to all federally funded clinical research in the US. Our other sort of primary regulatory apparatus in the US is just known as the Common Rule, also caught up to this internal NIH policy, and as of the year 2020 also requires that all institutions, and importantly, I think those that are located only in the United States, which are engaged in research conducted and supported by a federal department, must also rely on approval by a single IRB for the portion of the research that's conducted in the United States. So again, we see a sort of very strong statement by the federal government in the US saying, if you're doing multi-site clinical trials, you have to identify a single IRB of record that's going to be responsible for the principal review of the protocol. So a significant effort is emerging towards this notion of there being a single IRB that reviews research, which in theory could reduce the cost and time for completion of trials. There are a few limited exceptions I'm not going to mention, but just to give you a sense that there is gaining momentum, at least in the United States, around this issue. And I think more research needs to be done to identify whether and to what extent there are indeed efficiencies while maintaining quality and addressing those kind of local considerations that I mentioned earlier through this policy shift in clinical research oversight. So that's one area that I just wanted to touch on and introduce here. We can talk more about that if you'd like. The second core challenge or issue relates to the use of alternative trial designs in clinical research. So one type of design that one might fit within this category are pragmatic clinical trials. And for anyone who works in the clinical trial space who's been following this literature and the development of networks around the use of pragmatic trials, a commonly referred to framework for identifying the extent to which trials are pragmatic across a continuum, a multi-spectrum sort of continuum, is this PRACES 2 framework, or the Pragmatic Explanatory Continuum Indicator Summary 2 wheel. And as you can see, there are a number of different dimensions from recruitment to setting to the can observe, one can measure, I guess, a trial against and determine to what extent a trial is more or less pragmatic. And when we think about the spectrum, on one end of the spectrum are trials that are very explanatory, looking at mechanisms of action for different kinds of interventions. And at the other end of the spectrum are those trials that are highly pragmatic and have much flexibility in terms of procedures and protocols and the like. And the idea here behind pragmatic trials is that if implemented properly, in theory, they might be able to produce evidence that's more real world and more capable of guiding decision-making in clinical settings, be more helpful in a very controlled environment, which is more typical of explanatory control trials. But there are some ethics complexities that are